August 1942. America is at war. The country is not broke. Dollars still exist. Banks still open. Paychecks still clear. And yet the real fear inside the food system is not money. It is movement. It is rubber, rail capacity, farm labor, timing, replacement. The ugly physical question of whether food can still get from where it is grown to where it is needed before strain turns into shortage. Tire rationing had already begun in January 1942. Food rationing started in May, and the wartime system was already learning a hard lesson. Money does not move what logistics cannot. That is the frame almost everyone misses. The hedge was never just the thing you could store. It was the system that could reproduce necessities under pressure. And here is where the official memory gets soft. People remember thrift posters. They remember ration books. They remember patriotic gardens as morale theater. But the forensic record says something harsher. By 1943, more than 20 million victory gardens were producing 10 billion pounds of food. By 1944, they were supplying around 40% of America's vegetables. Not symbolism. Load-bearing output. So this video is not really about gold. Not yet. It is about what breaks first when normality fails, and what still works after that. Because once centralized distribution strains, the household stops being a consumer unit and starts becoming infrastructure. Elmer Powers understood that from the ground, not from Washington. He was a farmer in Boone County, Iowa, keeping a diary through 1932 and 1933, while prices collapsed around him. His record survives because he wrote from inside the stress, before historians turned it into lesson material. Stay with that, because once you see the household as a productive system, instead of a pile of assets, gold starts to look very different. The official story says households helped. The forensic record says households carried load. In 1943, more than 20 million victory gardens produced about 10 billion pounds of food. In 1944, those gardens supplied around 40% of America's vegetables. That is not wartime decoration. That is decentralized production stepping in when centralized distribution was under strain. And that distinction matters, because a passive saver waits for the system to deliver. A productive household reduces what the system has to deliver. That is the hidden mechanism, not abundance. Substitution, not wealth on paper. Pressure taken off the grid. 2/3 of those gardens were in towns, cities, and suburbs. Which means the country was not just asking farms to produce more. It was pushing some production back down to the household level, where distance was shorter, spoilage was lower, and transport requirements were almost zero. That is why the garden matters far beyond nostalgia. It changed the logistics equation. And once you see that, the Depression-era farm household starts to look less like poverty and more like an ugly form of resilience. Look at Iowa. Educational and historical records from Iowa show the pattern clearly. Farm families raised large gardens, canned fruit, kept dairy cows, collected eggs, baked bread from bulk flour and sugar, and in some households made clothing from flour and feed sacks. They were not insulated from price collapse. Far from it. But they still possessed something city households often did not. A way to convert labor into necessities without first converting it into cash. That is the part most modern balance sheets cannot see. Elmer G. Powers saw it from Boone County, Iowa. His diaries from the early 1930s survive because he recorded the Depression as it was happening, not after the mythology had settled. He was a tenant farmer who took over the family farm in 1933. His journal traces collapsing markets, New Deal intervention, and the daily grind of keeping a farm alive when prices no longer made moral sense. Quietdale Farm endured in part because it sat on productive land, and because the household still had a functioning relationship to output. That is a different kind of hedge. Not glamorous, not liquid, but stubborn. If you had tools, soil, jars, fuel, skill, and household labor, you are not rich, but you are harder to starve. And that is the first inversion in this story. In systemic stress, the thing that protects you first is not the asset that stores value best. It is the system that keeps producing after prices stop telling the truth. So what did that closed loop actually look like? Not in theory, in a kitchen, a shed, a cellar, a patch of ground behind the house. Iowa's historical education materials on the Depression give you the structure in plain language. Almost all farm families raised large gardens. They canned fruit from orchards. They had milk and cream from dairy cattle. Chickens supplied meat and eggs. They bought flour and sugar in 50-pound sacks and baked their own bread. And in some homes, women made clothing from flour and feed sacks. That is Iowa PBS, summarizing the lived household economy of the 1930s. iowaapps.org. Read that carefully, because none of those lines sound like investment performance. They sound like survival plumbing, food in, waste reused, labor converted, storage extended, cash deferred. And that is why some households bent without immediately breaking, not because the Depression was gentle. It was not. Farm prices collapsed. Debt still had to be serviced. Mortgages still came due. Banks still made demands in legal language that did not care how many jars you had in the cellar. But the household with land, tools, seed, preservation skill, and usable labor still possessed a shrinking island of independence inside a failing cash economy. That is the distinction. A closed-loop household does not eliminate pain. It changes the timing of failure. Elmer G. Powers is useful here because he was not writing theory. He was writing from Boone County, Iowa, as events were unfolding. In years of struggle, The Farm Diary of Elmer G. Powers, edited by H. Portimer, Roger Grant, and L. Edward Purcell. You watch a tenant farmer move through collapsing prices, mortgage pressure, federal programs, weather, and daily work. The diary matters because it records what abstract statistics cannot. Survival was not one decision. It was a sequence of small conversions under pressure. So, labor into feed, feed into livestock, livestock into cash, garden into meals, waste into utility, time into endurance. That is a regenerating system. Small, imperfect, exhausting, but a full small visit. And here is the point that matters for your money now. Usable wealth and nominal wealth are not the same thing. A brokerage statement is nominal wealth. A gold coin is nominal wealth. Even cash is nominal wealth. Useful, sometimes very useful, but none of them by themselves can plant a row, preserve a harvest, mend a gate, cook without the grid, or carry a household through a broken supply chain. Because when systems fail, the first question is not, what do you own? It is, what can still reproduce tomorrow? And once the question changes, the ranking of assets changes with it. And then there is the harsher test. Not prolonged depression, not wartime strain, siege. This is where sentimental thinking dies. In acute breakdown, exchange value collapses into replacement logic. You stop asking what an object is worth in peacetime. You ask what it can do by tonight. Can it heat a room? Purify water? Start a stove? Seal a leak? Charge a battery? Boil food? Buy one more day? That is why collapse memoirs and siege accounts keep converging on the same ugly result. Small consumables, fuel, medicine, batteries, candles, lighters, cartridges, and repair items begin to outrank prestige goods in the first line of survival. Not forever, but first. And that point matters because it corrects a fantasy a lot of people carry into crisis. They imagine value remains elegant. It does not. It becomes coarse. A necklace does not matter much to a household that cannot cook. A gold coin means less than dry wood if the room is cold enough. Jewelry cannot sterilize water. A lighter can. That does not mean precious metals become worthless. It means timing matters. Function comes first. Exchange comes second. Store value comes later, after some minimum order returns. That is the sequence: use value, then exchange value, then reserve value. Most people reverse it. They buy the reserve asset first and assume the rest will sort itself out. But the forensic record keeps saying the opposite. In the dangerous window, the winning household is not the one with the prettiest hedge. It is the one with the shortest path from labor to necessity. And this is where the romantic reading of resilience goes wrong. Resilience is not charming. It is repetitive. It is mechanical. It is often dull. It looks like extra fuel, spare parts, a pressure canner, a hand pump, a root cellar, a bicycle tire you can still patch, a neighbor who lends a tool and expects one back in working order. Not because these things are exciting, because they reproduce function. So when people say, "I just want to own something real," the next question should be immediate. Real in what sense? Real as a store of value or real as a system input? Because in the first phase of breakdown, that difference is everything. So what does the real hedge look like when you strip away the romance? Closer to a system design than an asset class. That is why the Amish example matters here. Not as a fantasy, not as a costume, as a working illustration of a lower complexity household economy that preserves productive capacity by limiting dependence on fragile outside inputs. Scholars of Amish agriculture describe a pattern that is easy to miss if you only look for yield per acre. Traditional horse-drawn farming reduces dependence on fuel-intensive machinery, keeps farm scale bounded, and ties production more tightly to family labor and local repair. Catherine Jellison's work on Lancaster County Amish farming in the 1930s emphasizes labor-intensive family farming over mechanized, capital-intensive agriculture, and studies of modern Amish farming describe it as a distinct ecological and low external input model that does not make Amish communities invulnerable. It makes the failure points different. A household built around animal power, repair skill, reciprocal labor, food preservation, and community work exchange can absorb certain shocks that a high-consumption suburban household cannot. Not all shocks, certain ones. Fuel shortages, supply chain interruptions, credit stress, delays in parts delivery, loss of convenience systems. That is the key distinction. The hedge is not perfection, it is fewer critical dependencies. And now the gold question comes back. Because gold has a buried weakness people do not like to name. It does not reproduce. It does not yield calories. It does not repair a pump. It does not sharpen a blade. It does not keep chickens alive. It does not preserve a harvest. It does not teach your household how to function under reduced inputs. Gold can store value across time. That matters. But in the first line of breakdown, it usually sits behind the productive system, not in front of it. It is a bridge asset. Later, after some local order reappears, after trade channels reopen, after there is enough stability for reserve value to matter more than immediate function. And the modern parallel is brutal for exactly that reason. Reuters reported from collapsing Venezuela in 2018 and 2019 that people were bartering fish, coffee beans, and hand-picked fruit for flour, rice, and cooking oil as cash failed to coordinate daily life. The exchange did not center on prestige. It centered on replenishment, on the next meal, on tomorrow's utility. That is the pattern. When formal markets stop clearing, households fall back to whatever still converts labor into food, fuel, and trust. So here is the conclusion the forensic record keeps forcing. The first hedge is not the object with the highest symbolic value. It is the system with the highest regenerative value. That means a household that can still produce some food, store some food, repair basic tools, reduce fuel dependence, improvise transport, and operate inside a web of trusted reciprocity is hedged in a way a purely extractive household is not. Let me be precise. This is not an argument against gold. It is an argument about sequence. Gold may still matter as a reserve asset, as a bridge, as a way to carry value across a monetary reset, or through a later phase of stabilization. But first-line survival belongs to productive capacity, first to the household that can keep functioning, then to the household that can trade, then, much later, to the household that can preserve surplus in higher-order stores of value. That is the order, and there's a caveat here. No household becomes fully self-sufficient in a modern economy. Scale still matters. Medicine still matters. Security still matters. Community failure can overwhelm individual preparation. A garden is not a force field. A pantry is not sovereignty. But the pattern still holds. When systems strain, the household that depends on smooth distribution discovers how fragile its assets really are. The household that owns even a small regenerating system discovers that resilience is not a feeling, it is throughput. So the binary choice is simple. You can build an extractive household, one that owns assets which only work when larger systems clear, or you can build a regenerative household, one that still converts labor into food, heat, repair, and trust when those systems begin to fail. One owns claims, the other owns function.